In this video, we are going to go through the initialization of a GitHub repository. It is not complicated in itself to initialize a repository, but GitHub has introduced a lot of new features and new best practices they would love you to follow. On the page to create a new repository, we can choose the name, the type of repository, whether we want it public or private, add a README, a gitignore file, and a license. The name of a package in NPM has to be lowercase. I would recommend you add the same name for the repository. A repository is often public when you want to create a public NPM package. You can have private NPM packages, but for this series of videos, we will just create a public one. The code will be visible by all, and your users can file issues and eventually contribute to your project, create pull requests to add features, and fix bugs. Adding a gitignore file on this page will let you choose between multiple types of projects. A gitignore file contains the list of files that Git should ignore when you commit and publish to your repository. You can create this file yourself and add the path of the files you want to ignore. You don't have to use one that is on the list, but I would recommend that you do that and you choose the node gitignore. The node gitignore contains common files that are generated by plugins, build tools, and need to be ignored. If you create the gitignore from scratch, you might miss some, and there is no reason really not to take advantage of what the community has already done. You can always modify the node gitignore after. If we take a look at the gitignore, we can see, for example, RPT2 cache. It is generated by a roller plugin for TypeScript, and you might not be aware of it and end up committing and pushing the directory by accident. You don't need to think about all of that if you're using the default node gitignore. Next, we can choose a license. The reason why a license is important for any project is because it acts as a legal document that indicates the permission that you give to other developers, companies on your project. So you will have licenses that will allow developers to use the project commercially for profit or will restrain the usage for non-profit. Depending on what license you choose, some companies might unauthorize their developers to use your project. If I write some new code, I own the copyright. That means I legally control who can't use my code. By releasing it via open source license, I give others the right to use my code. In legal terms, I grant others a copyright license, which is a promise not to sue when my copyright is infringed by your use of my code. Confusion can happen when it comes to licensing. There was actually a bit of a drama a couple of years ago about the license for one of the most popular JavaScript frameworks, which is React. After weeks of uncertainty and criticism from developers on major open source players, including Apache and WordPress, Facebook announced they will be relicensing their React JavaScript library and other projects under the popular MIT open source license. Because of all the confusion that can happen, you can use a website called chooselicense.com. It's a website created by GitHub that lists the different licenses that you can choose from when initializing the project. You can quickly see at a glance what those licenses authorized. The most popular one among open source projects is the MIT license. This license is simple and permissive. It allows other developers to use for non-profit or commercial purposes, copy, modify your code. One small note about the license is that by default, when we are going to initialize our NPM package with the npm init command, the license is set to ISC. When we go on the ISC page on chooselicense.com, we can see it gives similar authorizations as MIT. But really, what's important is to keep the license consistent. So to summarize, we are going to create a repository with a README, with the node gitignore, and an MIT license.